In such challenging times, I think we are all seeking knowledge, seeking solace, and really seeking community. And that's something we're really, really aware of happening across the Masorti universe and of course beyond. It's really, really important to us that we're able to create and curate sessions that reflect Masorti values, but also are really trying to reflect many positions and many truths at the same time. We want to make sure that there are spaces to think and to feel, and this session is really designed to hopefully do some of that. We're aware that we also need time to talk, but because this is a Zoom session, we're not going to really have that opportunity to talk today. More to think, and we hope that in the coming weeks we'll have more time to be together and to talk. So watch this space for more. I feel very honoured to be working, very closely with Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg, a senior rabbi of the Masorti movement and rabbi of New North London Synagogue in these incredibly painful times. And I'm going to hand over to you, Rabbi Jonathan, to take us into the first part of this evening's session. Thank you.
Thank you, and Rachel, I appreciate that everything that you and Martha and all the team at Masorti Judaism have done to try and reach out to so many of us, our communities, our students on campus for whom life is far from easy, and pupils at schools as well. Everybody, thank you for joining. There's two parts to this evening. The first will be very much about what is happening and how it's understood. And the second part will be a conversation about some of the feelings and some of the thoughts and some of the challenges of really trying to express ourselves and find words, as Rachel said. But for the first part, I want to welcome and appreciate Dr. Toby Greene, visiting fellow at the London School of Economics, but also a lecturer in political studies at Bar-Ilan University. You've been in Israel for 16 years and just come here. You've teach and write on the Israel-Palestinian conflict, but also in Israel's relationships with Europe and the UK and Israel's place in the world. So a global perspective as well. And I also want to welcome Professor Amnon Aran, Professor of International Politics of the Middle East, also a visiting scholar and fellow at the London School of Economics, specializing in the Arab-Israeli conflict. You've also been involved in policy-making forums, and you've published recently through the Cambridge University Press, Israeli Foreign Policy Since the End of the Cold War. And I'm just going to be asking some very, very broad questions about what's happening and appreciating your responses. So just maybe to start with you, if I may, Amnon, just things have changed in the last few days. Are you able, and then the same question will go to you, just to put us a bit in the picture of what's happening now?
Well, I think to some extent things have changed, and to some extent they haven't. I think in terms of the things that have changed, Israel has commenced what the Israelis called the ground maneuver into Gaza. So IDF forces have entered from the north and from the east. The IDF spokesman has said that the Gaza city is currently encircled. Obviously, there's been a very dramatic rise in Palestinian civilian casualties as well. At the same time, there's some things that actually have not changed that dramatically. So it seems as if that Hamas's command and control capacity is still intact. The salvos of rockets, which it has been firing into Israel since the beginning of the war, continue. The other thing, of course, looking at the north, is that, again, we see a bit of change and a bit of continuity. So since the beginning of the war, we've seen constant border skirmishes between the IDF and Hezbollah terrorists. What we have seen today, I think, is a bit of an uptick of the scope and intensity of Hezbollah's attacks on northern Israel. And tomorrow there is an expected speech by Hassan Nasrallah, where he will no doubt have what to say. So I think in some senses we are already in the 27th day of the war, but I cannot say at the moment that any of the sides has really achieved emphatically any of its aims that it set for itself. And I think that's where we are at the moment. With the last thing that I will say, we also have the international envelope around us, with the United States committing significant forces in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea, providing deterrence. Main aim is to avoid the Israel-Hamas war from spreading into a regional war. And of course, from the other side, Iran and potentially even Russia as well, obviously supporting their proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas.
I'm going to come back to that international envelope in a moment, but Toby, a lot has changed and yet hasn't changed. Is that also your perception?
Yeah, and I think Amnon's described a lot of the picture, entirely accurately. I guess a few things maybe that I would just add or supplement. It's a complicated picture. We have a number of different clocks moving at the same time. So we have a military process that's happening within the Gaza Strip and on other fronts as well, including the northern border, as you've heard, and also Houthi groups from Yemen that are also firing at Eilat in southern Israel, missiles and drones that Israel has so far intercepted. And we also have obviously a humanitarian issue that is escalating inside the Gaza Strip. There's a lot of diplomatic pressure around that. And there's a kind of diplomatic processes as well from all different sides. So you heard mention of the much anticipated speech of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, which is anticipated tomorrow. And there's also tomorrow, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken will arrive in Israel. He's likely to come reiterating his message of support for Israel's mission and its right to defend itself, but also with an increasing pressure on Israel to do more on the humanitarian side inside the Gaza Strip. So more access for trucks of aid. Israel's already agreed to increase the amount of aid that can go in from Egypt. They'll be pushing for more. And there's also this question of whether Israel will allow for humanitarian pauses that will help facilitate aid to move around and get people out. There are also, of course, various diplomatic processes going on around the release of Israeli and other hostages inside the Gaza Strip. And also, as Israel's military operation advances, of course, there are also new military casualties for Israel in the Gaza Strip. I think it's 15 or maybe up to even to 17 Israeli soldiers that have been killed in the Gaza Strip in the last 48 hours. One of them, Levi Lipschitz, was from a family from our community in Modi'in, not a family that we knew particularly well ourselves, but it's another kind of blow. And these are more blows, obviously, to Israeli society. But I think another constant, I'm going to refer to things that have stayed the same. I think Israel's determination is undimmed in the sense that Israelis, for all their differences, share the perspective that this is not a war of choice, but an existential struggle that it has to win. And the costs are going to be high. But I think the determination from an Israeli perspective to try and achieve its goal, as challenging as it is, to inflict a decisive defeat on Hamas so far is unchanged.
Just coming back to, because you both mentioned the international, particularly the American, but if you say a bit more about has America got skin in this war, and Europe as well, from that side, and also the role of Russia and Iran from the other. Just want to explore that international bit before coming back to the question of the hostages and the humanitarian side. Amnon.
Yeah, I mean, let me start by saying, and I'm going to say here something a bit dramatic, but I firmly believe in it. I firmly believe that President Biden saved the state of Israel through his decisive intervention, and I'll say in a minute in what sense. My reading is that it is almost completely thanks to American deterrence power and capabilities that we did not see the eruption of a war on 5 fronts. And the 5 fronts that I read are Gaza, Hezbollah, Iranian forces deployed in Syria, the Gaza Strip, obviously, Iran, and potentially, of course, the West Bank if such an eruption would have occurred. It is possible that Israel could have emerged out of such a dreadful war still standing. I'm sorry for the dry term, but I think that the physical destruction and the psychological shock of such an attack really would have transformed Israel into something completely different from what we know today. And I think in that specific sense, the United States has read Israel in possibly the most serious threat it has faced since the War of Independence. There is another level to that, of course. The Americans also have read very carefully from a strategic point of view that this is also an opportunity for sort of to, if you like, create an architecture in the Middle East that very much suits their interests. Remember that the timing of this attack launched by Hamas coincided only a week before with the Saudi Crown Prince saying that, normalization talks are going very well. And I think this is something that we need to bear in mind as well. So the Americans here do recognize that they have potentially an opportunity of really creating an historic, almost Israeli-Arab alliance, which began with the Abraham Accords. But there is also, of course, the other opportunity. If Israel does not achieve the goals that it set for itself, or if it would have faced the kind of war that I described earlier, the United States could have faced probably the worst pushback in the Middle East that it has faced. And that, of course, is also connected to the war in Ukraine. There is a bigger global dynamic that is going on here. Israel-Hamas is, in one sense, a global clash, a local clash, forgive me. But of course, in the other sense, it is embedded in this regional and global level as well. So I think the Americans are at the moment really trying to strike this very careful balance between, on the one hand, keeping a humanitarian effort, a serious one in Gaza, partly also to their Arab partners and so on and so forth, but on the other hand, securing Israel's ability to survive and remain as we more or less know it, but also very much in the front of their mind, this potential, I would say, opportunity to, if you like, reconfigure the Middle East in a way that will suit their interest and their allies' interest.
Thank you. And nobody have I heard stronger support than the Ukrainian bishop in London, who immediately got it and said, well, the Wagner brigade trained Hamas. The Toby, Iran, the wider geopolitical aspect of this, and then I want to come back again to the humanitarian and the hostages and this talk about ceasefire.
No, I think again, Amnon framed things very, 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 very effectively. I'll just embellish or add a couple of things. Just to sort of relay some of the latest analysis that I'm hearing from Israeli commentators, the ones that I respect, is their assessment is still at this point, and this may well be due to the deterrence that the US has put in place that Amnon described, that though Hezbollah has notably stepped up its attacks on the northern border, that it's still at a level where they're anticipating that the decision of Hezbollah will not be to go all in into this conflict, and that they do remain sufficiently deterred. But they say the kind of the Israeli commentators, the most knowledgeable and expert ones, that's what we think, but we can't be sure. We've been mistaken very recently in the past, and so we have to watch very, very carefully. On the wider strategic picture, I think it's not only the US that perceives this conflict in its wider context, in the sense that they realize or perceive that if Hamas is seen to win and this conflict is seen to emerge as a victory or a success for Iran, that will have catastrophic long-term consequences, not only in terms of Israel's deterrence against a whole range of enemies that are backed by Iran, but also in terms of the wider strategic picture, the ability to pursue the normalization process, and indeed a two-state solution, which the Americans would like to put back on the table if there's a more moderate Israeli government down the line. I think it's not only the Americans that have drawn those conclusions. I think the British government has the same position. Indeed, Keir Starmer, if you heard his speech that he made to Chatham House a couple of days ago as leader of the opposition, leader of the Labour Party, although under considerable pressure from within his own party, is essentially also staying so far to a similar kind of assessment that Hamas that a ceasefire at this point would embolden Hamas, is what he said. So, and I think you see a similar perspective from many European leaders until this point.
Thank you. Can I ask you something which I hear around me a lot, which is the war futile? is it possible to defeat a terrorist organization like Hamas militarily? Because is this not producing the next generation of hate and of Hamas? And is that a war aim a feasible one, or is only a political solution going to achieve it? And I'm going to start with you, Toby. I realize it's a very painful question to ask.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question. Something I've actually written about with a colleague for an Israeli policy audience. I think that perhaps one of the criticisms that we might level at the Israeli government so far in this conflict is it's not accompanied its clear definition of its military aims with a clear vision of its political goals, as in what kind of reality it would like to see in the Gaza Strip if it succeeds in removing Hamas. Can Hamas be destroyed militarily? Well, I think at a military level, it can be. It comes with enormous costs. It will take time. It will be very destructive costs to Israel, and of course, terrible costs to innocent Palestinians as well. But I think a decisive military victory is possible if those costs can be endured. But of course, the ideology and the underlying social conditions, I think, which have helped fuel that ideology, cannot be destroyed with military means. And for that reason, I think one of the things that Secretary Blinken will be saying to his Israeli counterparts, maybe in private more than in public, when he visits tomorrow, he'll be in Israel and then he'll be in Jordan. But I think he'll be saying to the Israelis, maybe behind closed doors, what's the plan for the day after? Because American experience from its own, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, is that defeating the terrorist enemy doesn't get you necessarily where you want to be if you don't have a clear sense of what kind of political alternative you're going to put in place afterwards. And in fact, President Biden said that openly: don't make our mistakes, don't repeat our mistakes. I agree, Hamas must be destroyed, but what's going to come afterwards? And I think the pressure is going to increase on Israel to articulate that goal, because, and that relates also to a long-term diplomatic outlook, because without that, long-term defeat of Hamas and the ideology of Hamas isn't going to be possible.
Amnon, the defeat of Hamas.
Yeah, I mean, I think Toby is really put down the argument very, very clearly, and I agree with him. I think just possibly to add, I would say two things. The first is that Hamas was only really established as an organization in 1987. It is effectively a sort of extension of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's not as if it's been around forever and therefore it's destined to stay forever. I agree completely with Toby that it is possible to, if you like, eliminate its military capabilities. And I agree that the cost would be high. I think, though, that actually defeating Hamas militarily is a precondition possibly to avoid that next generation of hate, as you put it. I think what has I don't need to explain to this audience, but the nature of the massacre that Hamas committed reflects the fact that really this is not an organization, this is not a movement that, as long as it has a military capacity, I think it would be very, very difficult, impossible, frankly, to achieve any kind of political solution with the Palestinians. Even Yossi Beilin, Dr. Yossi Beilin, who was one of the architects of the Oslo process, said that yesterday on Andrew Marr's show. He said, "Look, I, as a man of peace, have to reach that recognition." I think when we talk about a political solution, and there are a number of those floating around, the most common one, which I'm not sure that will materialize, but nevertheless, since it's the most common, I'll say something about it. Some sort of arrangement where the Palestinian Authority or Fatah or the PLO sort of are reinstated in the Gaza Strip. If that were to happen, there would have to be a comprehensive agreement that also includes significant changes in the West Bank as well. So the thought that somehow the Palestinian Authority will simply sort of come into the Gaza Strip on the back of the Israeli forces and assume government, I think is probably unrealistic. So I think inevitably any kind of political solution that does not involve Israeli long-term control of the Gaza Strip. And I think apart from some Israeli extremists, such as Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, or Orit Struk, these kind of people who've said that they want to go back to the Gaza Strip, apart from that, seems to me a consensus that there is no will of the Israelis for long-term control or occupation. And therefore, any kind of political thinking around that will have to include a partnership with the Palestinian Authority and a deal that actually involves a comprehensive treatment of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, preferably under an umbrella of a resumed peace agreement with Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. It's all really chastening to listen to. Thank you. The humanitarian cost, that's what we're seeing here in Britain and in many places, on the fronts of the papers, very, very hard to bear. And I wanted to ask you about that. Is to what extent there are laws of war. Israel's supporters have said, even those who said this is a necessary and inevitable war, the wars of law must be abided by. How do you see that, and the humanitarian cost, and the place of and the chances of the hostages being brought home safe and well in all of this? Again, I'll start with you, Toby.
Yeah, very, very challenging. It's obviously a very, very difficult situation. I think we need to firstly kind of remind ourselves that the shape of this conflict, this war in urban areas, is one that's really essentially designed by Hamas. It's there, it serves their ends to have a war amidst the civilian population and put their military capabilities in civilian areas and underneath civilian areas. This puts Israel in very acute dilemmas. Of course, Israel insists that it's fighting within the laws of international law. These laws are complicated, frequently not very well understood, certainly by many on the outside. And of course, it's right that Israel is scrutinized and is held to those standards, which it says that it is observing. Clearly, Israel is making efforts to try and separate the civilian from the military population. Some of those efforts have been successful. Many, I think, up to 1 million or more Palestinians have been persuaded under Israeli instruction to move out of Gaza City and move south. Of course, a great many remain. Some are being compelled or persuaded to stay by Hamas, or unable to move for other reasons. We know, of course, also there are many Palestinians dying, many Palestinians dying and suffering. And maybe Israel could be more clear and consistent in both its actions and in its measures to bring humanitarian aid in. There is clearly a tension between Israel's goal of defeating Hamas and the parallel goal of releasing hostages. And there is a lot of debate and difficulty in Israel. It's almost torture, I think, for Israeli society to try and reconcile these goals. Of course, we have had 4 hostages released by Hamas, one who was freed in a military operation inside the Gaza Strip. We have had talk, or Hamas, in fact, Hamas spokesmen have suggested that they might be willing to release all the prisoners in return for a release of all Palestinian prisoners held in Israel. That idea got some interest in Israel, but was rubbished by the Israeli defense minister as a kind of psychological game. There have been other suggestions from Hamas spokesmen that they might be imminently willing to release some of the foreigners or those with the foreign passports. There's obviously a lot of international pressure around that. We'll have to see how it develops. I think one other thing I would mention, there is a big gap between what we're seeing when we watch international media and what the Israeli public see. The Israeli media, and I watch a lot of Israeli television, they don't really show the kind of footage of Palestinian civilian casualties that we see on the international media. And that is creating a growing gap in perception between what Israelis perceive as happening and what those observing from the outside. I think that gap is maybe problematic. I think it's potentially dangerous for Israel. And I think it's important for us, both morally, but also, for many reasons, for us not to avert our eyes from Palestinian suffering, from the suffering of innocent people in the Gaza Strip. And maybe also, and this is a very difficult thing to do, but to try and convey the appropriate ways, appropriate levels to our Israeli friends, some of that, try to narrow some of that gap so that people can see a little bit of what they're not seeing on the Israeli television, and understand how international support and the ability of Israel's friends to advocate for Israel, both Jewish communities and non-Jewish politicians, is related to the humanitarian situation, and there is a need to understand have some perspective of what is being seen outside of Israel about what's going on in the Gaza Strip that Israelis are not necessarily seeing.
So that gap in what people are seeing and how that affects international perception of Israel and the humanitarian cost, the calls for a truce to allow more of a humanitarian corridor, the calls for a ceasefire. Amnon, your thoughts?
So, if I may, I'll come back to the point of the ceasefire in a second. I think there's one aspect with the risk of appearing slightly introspective. I think one aspect that has almost not been discussed at all is actually also the humanitarian situation in Israel. We've got in Israel, you've got 126,000 people displaced. You've got an economy that's running in a war routine, and you've got children that are very selectively going to school. I agree with Toby completely that the resolve of Israeli society remains undented. But I think that if this war is going to be a very prolonged war, as the Israeli government is warning for a long time, the question, this kind of situation in Israel will also become an increasing factor that will weigh on the government. Or not weigh, that will become another factor that the government will have to take into consideration. And of course, that is in parallel to the terrible situation that Israel found itself having now 240 hostages kidnapped into the Gaza Strip. And I would say that on that note, I'm very sorry to use fairly sort of dry language, but my sense is that Hamas has not really started yet to use the hostages as a weapon, which undoubtedly I fear it will. And I think we have not yet seen that. They have not really made any kind of tactical demands, even not, for example, releasing. Remember, they also have hostages not with dual citizenship, but hostages who are from other countries, Thai workers, for example, right? People from the Philippines. Even that, they have not yet said, okay, right, we want fuel into the Gaza Strip. We want a pause in exchange for just releasing them before we've even started to talk about the Israeli hostages. So I think only these two things are very, very big issues. Now, of course, returning to your question about a ceasefire and the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which is terrible and horrific. There's no other way to describe it. And also to the issue of international law. I agree completely with Toby that Israel should be scrutinized. I think where we are now, though, is in a place where Israel really has to strike a very delicate balance between two, if you like, principles. One is the duty that every government has to protect its citizens, its borders, and going back to this idea, which I do believe in, that this is an existential war on the one hand, and then on the other hand, to work within, I would say, the framework of international law when conducting such a war effort. And Toby is absolutely right that these laws are very difficult and complicated, and my fear is that everybody will interpret them effectively in the way that they sort of approach the conflict in the first place. So I think this is what we're seeing from the part of the Israelis. My sense is that the more Israel, Egypt, UAE agencies, and the United States can really consolidate this humanitarian zone in the south of the Gaza Strip, so south from Gaza City to the south, and provide it with sufficient aid for the requirements that the citizens need, that would be, I think, a very sound way of continuing with the war effort, and also ensuring as much as possible under these terrible circumstances that international law is abided by, and that also Israel has real concern to all these innocent Palestinians that are dying and being wounded and have been displaced as well. I think in regards to the ceasefire, I think at this moment in time, the idea of simply a humanitarian ceasefire, I personally would not support. I think any pause in the war, which is extremely complicated militarily, because you've just maneuvered a massive amount of troops and soldiers and tanks and so on. You can't simply just hold, especially given that they are in the Gaza Strip. It's not simply holding, they need to defend themselves and so on and so forth. So what sort of a lot of external observers are saying, just quote unquote humanitarian ceasefire is not just. It's a very complicated thing to do, which has its own price tag. And therefore, I think that every move towards a humanitarian pause in the fighting, as President Biden has described it, let alone a ceasefire, has to come hand in hand with a clear humanitarian gesture by Hamas, which would include the release of hostages, at least the babies, the elderly women, and so on. Remember, and I think this was one mistake that I would say that possibly the Israelis made, is that the aid has been increased, but even the representatives of the Red Cross have not even seen the Israeli hostages or any other hostage for that matter. I think that was a mistake. And I think the second problem that we have is that the Israeli government has really fallen short in its civilian response in comparison to Israeli civil society, which has been very active. So I think these two principles, these two, if you like, these two principles really have to be shored up for the war to continue in the way that Israel can both achieve its goals and retain some sort of moral framework towards Palestinian and critically towards its own civilians inside Israel as well.
Listen, thank you both. We're coming to the end of this first part. I just want to say whether, each of you, 2 or 3 key sentences you want to leave us with. And I want to give a big thank you, and also to say, as this goes on, it would be we'd be so grateful if we can return to you, because you're so incisive, so perceptive, and you say some very difficult things very clearly. So a big thank you. Toby, a couple of sentences, no obligation there, you've said so much, but a couple of sentences you want to leave us with, and then the same to you, Amnon.
I mean, I think we I don't have anything very substantive to add. I guess I just share, I'm sure, with all of the people on the call. I hope this is going to end as quickly as possible, but also reiterate what I think Amnon and I have both shared, which is this awful dilemma between knowing how catastrophic and damaging this war is, but also knowing at the same time the stakes for Israel. If Hamas is seen to come off a victor in this conflict, and that is the terrible dilemma that we're facing, and we can only hope that it ends as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Amnon, a closing sentence or two?
Just maybe 3 quick points. I think the key issue really is whether the Israel-Hamas war can remain contained and not spread into a regional war, which would mean a whole different affair. I think that's point number 1. I think point number 2, any future discussions about a Palestinian state are predicated on the outcome of this war. If Hamas is left standing, I think it's pretty clear that there cannot be a Palestinian state in the foreseeable future, and vice versa. And just to share Toby's hope that this terrible war will end as soon as possible with the most favorable outcome that Israel can achieve, with the minimum loss of innocent life in the process. And just to thank you as well for inviting us and having us. This is an extremely difficult time for everybody. So just to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to the community.
Thank you both hugely, and if we can return to you at some time in the future and have your wisdom and insight again, that's appreciated. I'm going to hand back now to Rachel, and you're going to facilitate what will be a more, I guess, personal and more sort of Jewishly, spiritually, emotionally focused conversation with Rabbi Joel, Rachel, and myself. Thank you.
Thank you. So as Rabbi Jonathan has said, I think that was a really good analysis, very informative, has left me feeling slightly anxious, I'm aware. But I think sometimes when we talk, it's very, when we talk, we need to know we need to have information, and we need to have understanding, and that was really important. I think at the same time, what we're really struggling with is understanding what this means as a Jewish people, and what this conflict means for each of us as Jewish people. I'm also conscious, Rabbi Joel and Rabbi Jonathan, that you're both incredibly important, within our community as a whole and within your own individual communities, but you're also in really different positions. Rabbi Joel, you are the Rosh Yeshiva in Jerusalem, as well as the rabbi of Kol Nefesh Masorti here in the UK. So already that's a split role, with a split community feeling and thinking different things. And Rabbi Jonathan, your role here is with New North London, but, you know, as a figure in the whole community, you know, involved, as you mentioned before, multi-faith, interfaith sections. And I think those positions are really important and what they involve. Joel, I'm conscious that we've spoken a lot in the last few weeks, and every time I speak to you, I say, "How are you?" And Joel wryly smiles back at me and laughs at the banal and impossible question that I'm asking of him. So I'm going to try not to ask that question. And really what I want to start with is for you to give us a little bit of where your heart is at the moment today. And I know it's ever changing, but what your main thoughts and feelings are as you reflect upon the current situation over there.
Right. Thank you, Rachel. So I was supposed to travel to the UK a couple of weeks ago and last week, and I've pushed that off. And at this stage, certainly feel that I cannot leave Israel, which is something that a lot of Israelis are feeling, that even in these kinds of terrible times, in some ways, it's easier to be here than it is to be outside the land. Because the immediate response to the atrocities was and the waiting and the onset of the war that's beginning now, the ground assault on the Gaza Strip is very, very Jewish, meaning my heart is bleeding for my brothers and sisters and the children of my friends who are serving, and the people who we've lost. It's been very, very close, as everyone I'm sure knows, to almost everybody in Israel has felt personal loss, a series of funerals and shivers, and to have friends with 4 children serving in the Gaza Strip in uniform is almost unbearable, and that's involved everyone left, right, and center, and the profound rifts which have really cracked Israeli society over the course of the last year have been set aside, and some of those same people who were organizing those demonstrations are now actively involved in the civil response, which has stepped up in the place of governmental response to civil society has responded tremendously in terms of taking refugees from around the Gaza Strip and housing them and caring for them, and in an astonishing way. So I have been in a kind of profound identification with my people and its suffering, which has not just been, I suppose, to do with the suffering that took place 3-4 weeks ago, but also that tapped into millennia of Jewish suffering. And we witnessed a pogrom, and there have been many pogroms over the years that no one saw, and communities would have been wiped out and simply vanished from the map, and you'd hear months later of that suffering. But this was the first time that it's happened in real time, and we've witnessed the barbarity, and we have absolute clarity in Israel about the implacable nature of our enemy and the impossibility of doing business with that enemy. And I would say I've been in that mode for 2-3 weeks. What's shifting at the moment is partly to do with an increasing sense that the purpose of terrorism is to paint us into a world which is absolutely black and white. That's the purpose of terrorism. It's to create the binary of with us or against us. It's to create that sense that I'm on one side and the Arabs are on the other side, and it's to contract any form of complexity and to paint the world in simple terms, and to split exactly those kinds of alliances that Toby and Amnon were talking about, which are absolutely central and essential to the outcome of this conflict. The emergence of a moderate Arab democratic world, which will stand as an alternative to the totalitarian Arab world. It's no surprise that Russia and Iran are lining up here, and maybe even China as well. Not because Russia and China are committed to the forms of communism that existed in the past, but they are committed to the maintenance and respectability of totalitarianism. And I think that the response of the Americans has been to say, in a very powerful way, that the Americans are going to support a vision of the world, not trying to spread democracy, but at least trying to protect those countries which are democratic. And Israel stands as the only democratic country in the Middle East. And America has maneuvered itself to support Israel as a country which, in theory at least, can provide a pivot around which the democratization of the Middle East can take place with moderate Arab countries through the Abraham Accords. So what's shifting in me at the moment, so you shut me up if you want me to stop, but what's shifting in me at the moment is that it's really, really important for us not to have our narrative determined by Hamas. That our narrative, the story we tell, cannot be a narrative. I felt myself kind of defeated by Hamas in the first 3 weeks, because the stories I was telling were kind of Hamasi stories about whose side am I on, kind of thing. And that's not normally the way I think about the world. And I'm sort of emerging from my cocoon and beginning to think that perhaps the most important thing for us to do now is to break that binary, and to say with absolute clarity that the purpose for the war in the Gaza Strip is to defeat a Islamo-fascist version of Islam, which is resolutely applying itself to the destruction of the state of Israel. And that has to be defeated, not because I want to crush the Palestinians, but because I would like to see Palestinian society flourish, and it can't flourish under totalitarianism. And which means that compassion and concern for Palestinian civilians is part of the equation, in the moral equation, that we need to emphasize. We shouldn't be backing away from, we shouldn't be entering into some kind of competition to see who is suffering most, which we will lose, because it's clear that God willing, that the number of Palestinian victims, innocent victims of this war, will outweigh the number of Israeli victims. God willing, I hope it stays like that. But that it doesn't contradict our aims to have compassion for innocent Palestinians caught up. On the contrary, it's absolutely essential that we have that compassion, and it's also absolutely essential that that we paint a picture of our goals for the flourishing of Palestinian society alongside Israeli society following on from this conflict, and the flourishing of moderate Islam in the Middle East through the Abraham Accords, and that our goals are do not involve breaking Palestinian society in any way. On the contrary, we're looking to see it flourish, and in order for that to happen, we have to unfortunately work our way through an organization which has committed itself to the destruction of the state of Israel. So that's where I'm holding, and that involves really, and this is maybe a place where the British community also can have a role, that in some way we have to reconnect ourselves to nuance, to reach out and re-engage with interfaith dialogue with moderate Muslim leaders, to find ways of communicating, to break down the from the river to the sea motif, because that is also a totalitarian motif which is calling, I believe, for the destruction of the state of Israel, and we should oppose that as vehemently as we oppose the extremists on the Jewish side, who are also hold a vision of from the river to the sea in Jewish control. And I think it's already the case in Israel that there's a growing awareness that the failures of the right in Israeli society are in some way the background to this conflict, and that the future will involve us radically recommitting to a vision of peace with our neighbors, as which goes hand in hand with this bloody conflict that we find ourselves in now.
Thank you, Joel. I guess I want to ask Rabbi Jonathan a sort of similar but slightly different question. As you know, as the senior rabbi of Masorti Judaism, but also as somebody who is involved very much in civil society, what are the issues that feel most important at the moment that we deal with and we talk about and we think about as a community? What are you really with as you go through day by day your interactions with people?
Thank you. First of all, I listen to you, Joel, with the greatest respect. Every word you say. You're right. I think things do look and feel different from here and from outside Israel in many ways. And talking to European colleagues earlier today, we were both in that conversation. Britain seems to be one of the more difficult places in Europe to be at the moment. In terms of the community, I see several things that really, really matter. It goes without saying that we need to do our utmost to support, that part of our one big Jewish family who's living in Israel, who's suffered horrible bereavements, whose family are taken hostages, whose children are called up to the front and fighting in Gaza. And that is personal contact, that is financial support. That's simply what it means to be part of the Jewish family. I'm using the word family deliberately now. And that's an obligation. It's not just an obligation. I think it's what everybody wants to do. I think, the worst thing for many people is feeling that question, what can I do? Committing and connecting is really helpful to us as well. Another kind of message is about, in the face of trauma, is about resilience. And I take a lot of comfort in this deep and profound resilience of the Jewish people, kind of almost as a symbol of it. I sometimes pick up my grandfather's Kiddush cup and think, you brought that out of Germany after you were in Dachau. I don't want to compare situations, but there is, we belong to a people which is profoundly resilient. And I think the secrets of that resilience lie in community and connection with Torah. So trying to make sure, as best we can, that people, wherever they are, feel connected to our community. And that involves people there are 76 campuses with Jewish students studying in them. And within those campuses, there are departments where there may be the only Jewish student in that department, so that the fact that there's a Jewish society a mile or two away isn't actually impacting on their daily lives. And there's a profound sense of isolation, and really reaching out to everybody we can, including many Israelis who've taken refuge here or suddenly find themselves, here I am without Jewish community because I didn't seek it before. That's the second thing, and connecting that with Torah, because Torah is our spiritual strength and our center and our learning. And I'm very, that day when you and your colleague Rabbi Shuki decided we're not giving up on the online courses we're doing about the environment, I think that was the triumph of the Jewish spirit. The third thing then is we are very deeply a part of society here, and that needs concern. There is little we can probably do over the big decisions made in Israel. Probably there's nothing we can do about it. but we can have a difference, make a difference here. Now, part of that, I've been meetings with the Met, with the Metropolitan Police, with senior politicians as part of Jewish delegations. But the more challenging piece is how we reach out to other parts of our society, because British society here is also in danger of disintegration. It's not got the same kind of threats that the threats to Israel have, but nevertheless, people feel unsafe and uncertain. I've now been in several meetings with Muslim groups, Muslim and Christian groups. I was facilitating one today, which was really difficult. I can't say too much because I would give away a kind of confidentiality about it. But the anger and the pain were really on the table. They were there, and we had to recognize it. And they came from both sides, viscerally. And what do you do when somebody with Palestinian connections says, you say you heard nothing from your family for 24 hours after the brutal Hamas attack? People are clear about, that group was clear about what they thought about Hamas. You know, what would you do when you can hear nothing for 3 weeks as to whether the whole of your family is living or dead, because there simply is no telecommunication with Gaza? And what do you say? So trying to find common language with the Muslim community, and perhaps even harder with some of the, I hate to say it, white British left and right, is really difficult. There is a way forward in the fact that I hear similar words about feeling lonely, feeling pain, feeling traumatized, wondering if I'm wanted here from Muslim people, especially women, that I hear from Jews. And I'm thinking that exploration and empathy with each other's pain, without committing to comment on our view of the political situation, gives a way of talking. So that's the three really. Engagement with our Jewish family in Israel, community in Torah, reaching out and not being afraid. And I'll finish with this. In that group today, a Muslim academic said, in the first 2 weeks after Hamas's attack, nobody reached out to me. And my first thought was, well, why should they reach out to you? And then I thought, you're right. You're not Hamas. You're feeling horrified. I should have reached out to you. I should have said, this is difficult for you. I'm going to try and learn from that.
Thank you, Jonathan. We haven't got so much time, but there's just a final question I would like to ask you both that's sort of been on my mind, and I think both of you sort of began to talk about, was about these sort of themes of, I suppose, hope and strength. It is difficult. And all of the people within the community, and especially, and I don't think it's especially the young people, but a lot of young people, young adults, are feeling that they don't have the words. And I'm wondering about whether there are places that you draw strength from, whether there are Jewish ideas of which you draw strength from, whether there are places that you draw strength from, and whether or not you could think about how you share that with us here tonight. And whoever would like to answer first may answer. This is to both of you.
The yeshiva carried on studying through the whole of the last month, and no student went home because of the political situation, the military situation. And I'm not quite sure why that's the case, but I suspect it's because the community was very, very strongly standing together, and the activity that we were engaged in felt spiritually potent. And we started davening closer together. We moved our chairs closer together. I mean, I think in general people should pray standing closer together, because it's because prayer is about carving out community. It's about building and creating community. That's not something that happens automatically. It's something through raising voices together. And I've drawn a lot of strength from the community I'm a part of here. And I also think that part of what religious life does is to allow us to rehearse our ultimate values. Like that's it needs rehearsing, because it's like sand, it slips through our fingers. That's why we have to say the Shema twice a day. Like, you know, the reason why religious ritual is repetitive is because it's really hard to stay committed to what you really should be committed to. And it needs constant reminding to hold it in mind. What am I ultimately committed to? And if that means holding out a vision, like, you know, we do have a prophetic vision of people living at different countries and different faiths living in peace with each other. And we have to keep recommitting to our vision, and then have the courage to walk through the world and hold that vision and take it seriously. It's profoundly mythic. We have to take our myths really seriously, and then walk with them and hold them and have the courage to keep recommitting to them. And I think, say something a little challenging, just to end with that. And you know, 75 years ago, or 80, 90 years ago, young people used to come to Israel to drain swamps, to create this society, and to take personal risk in order to build the kind of society that they wanted to build here, a new kind of Jewish collective. And a lot of the time now, we're expecting young people to come to Israel in order to have educational experiences, or to be looked after, or to have a nice holiday, or to surf, or to whatever it is that people are looking for on the beaches of Tel Aviv. And I actually think there are still swamps to be drained in this country, and a country to be built, and a vision to be created. And it's the time to come. It's the time for young people to come with a fundamentally non-violent, pluralistic, non-fundamentalist vision of what religious Zionism could look like, what the state of Israel could look like. What is a Masorti, non-fundamentalist vision for the state of Israel, the Jewish collective? And that work has yet to be done. We discovered through the struggles of the last year that the basic questions around how we structure our life in Israel are yet to be resolved. And that will be the fight of them. If we can survive over the course of next year and go back to what really matters for us, which is the kind of civilization we construct, then those questions are all to play for. And there's a genuine question about whether Israel will be in the image of those totalitarian societies that we're actually fighting against now, because there are plenty of voices within Israeli society which are in favor of the use of the coercive power of the state to impose Judaism on the collective. And it's precisely that question which I think we have to reconnect to in the conflict with Hamas, when we can say that the reason why we're fighting against totalitarian Islam is because we're trying to create a non-totalitarian vision of Israel, where Jewish civilization will flourish, not because it's under the coercive power of a rabbanut, but because Jewish people live in peace and freedom, and their creativity will be allowed to flourish, and the Judaism that emerges from that will be an entirely new phenomenon. It will be a new phenomenon if we're allowed to engage with our creativity in a free way and not subject to the coercive power of the state. And that struggle is yet to be had. And we need young people to commit to that and to come. And I would urge, this is a time to actually pack your bags and come and spend time in Israel. And it's the time to have missions. It's the time to visit. I know that Rabbi Jonathan is going to be coming next week, but it's the time to actually put your money where your mouth is and commit to building the kind of society here that we want to build together.
Thank you, Joel. That's very moving. I feel moved. Rabbi Jonathan, to just to finish off, and
then that prayer. Yeah, Joel, from your mouth to God's ears. Absolutely. I have to admit, I'll just be frank, I find this time really, really difficult. I'm spending a lot of time with people who would disagree with a lot of what's been said here tonight, who will tell me that what Israel's doing, you know, I hear the word genocide around me. I have to talk to members of my own community who think it, even if they don't use it, and some use it. I'm listening to people who, I'm seeing the pictures of bombed out places in Gaza, and it's challenging. And I think for a lot of the community are feeling that kind of under sort of moral and spiritual siege. So where does one find strength is an absolutely central question. And, you know, on a different scale, just, you know, very similar to what you said, Joel, I think we need to commit to good, positive things we can do for Israel, for our Jewish community, you know, in whatever way in life. If our life is dedicated to positive things, we must not lose sight of those overall goals. We need to keep at them. We need to keep our vision intact, and that's what our Torah is ultimately for. And we need to keep our own hearts strong. And part of that is friendship. Part of that is talking regularly with each other here and in Israel. But part of that also, and I'll say this a little bit strange perhaps, my heart feels strengthened when I've been able to listen to another person's pain. And, you know, and then, you know, in a way, it doesn't matter whether that person agrees with me or not. It doesn't matter whether that suffering is Jewish or not. If one feels in contact with the God who's present in all tears, then that gives us strength. And the strength it gives is a profoundly human strength that says, keep human, keep your heart alive, keep your soul aspiring, keep caring for people. And I, you know, in this time of war, I'm still trying to hang on to the fact that the central value is chesed, even now. Those are some of the things I try to find strength from.
Thank you, Rabbi Jonathan. I think with that, I'd like to invite two people, Rabbi Joel, who I think are with you. Are they there? Okay, to lead us in a prayer. Dr. Susanna Cohen and Shira Levy Cohen are going to lead us in a song, Sinai. And please feel free to join in at home. Are you unmuted? Okay, please go ahead. Thank you.
שיר למעלות, אשא עיניי אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי מעם עושה שמיים וארץ, אל יתן למות רגליך, אל ינום שומרך, הנה לא ינום ולא ישן שומר ישראל, השם שומרך, השם צילך, על יד ימינך. יומם השמש לא יככה, וירח בלילה, השם ישמורך מכל רע, ישמור את נפשך, השם ישמור צאתך ובואך, מעתה ועד עולם, מעתה ועד עולם.
Yeah, Susanna, thank you. That was absolutely beautiful. I think with that, we will close to an end. I'd like to thank everybody participating, for being here, for showing up, for being part of this community. Rabbi Jonathan, Rabbi Joel, really thank you. Thank you for your wisdom, and thank you for your leadership, and thank you for being here. Amnon and Toby as well, thank you so much for participating and helping us try to make sense of what's going on. And with that, I wish everybody good night, and hope to see everybody really soon. Laila Tov.